If your faith feels like it's falling apart right now, if the questions just won't stop, if the answers that used to work suddenly don't, you've probably heard something like this. Be careful because you're deconstructing, and that is how people lose their faith. But what if that's not what's happening at all? What if you're not losing your faith? What if instead you're outgrowing a certain version of it? What if that feeling of collapse is actually spiritual growth and development under pressure? I want you to think about that, because this is what I want you to hear very clearly today. Deconstruction is not the destruction of faith. It's often what growth looks like when a faith that once worked is no longer able to speak to the truth of the way the world is, or the way you are. And once you see that, then you may realize something that is incredibly important, and that is this: there is nothing wrong with you. And if this is where you are right now, if you are questioning, if you are unraveling, if you are trying to stay honest without losing yourself, then this channel exists for that journey. Because I make videos for progressive Christians, questioners, and the church alumni. You know, those people who live on the edge of faith, whether they have left the church or whether they're still sitting in the pews. And if that is you, you are welcome here. So, subscribe to the channel, pull up a chair, and stay a while. Most Christians aren't afraid of questions, but many are afraid of what the questions might mean. Because for many Christians, faith was never just about God. It was also about certainty, belonging, safety, knowing who is in and who is out, and feeling secure, knowing how the story of your life ends. So when the questions start coming, questions about the Bible, history, suffering, justice, sexuality, hell, or even prayers not working, then the questioning doesn't just feel intellectual. It feels downright existential. And many churches tend to reinforce this fear by saying something like, hey, if you question too much, your faith is going to collapse. But that only happens if faith and certainty are the same thing, and they are not. Here's one of the most important distinctions you can make. Faith is not the same thing as certainty. Certainty is psychological. It's about control. It's about closure. It's about reducing anxiety. And meanwhile, faith, when it is at its best, is relational. It is about trust. It is about orientation. It is about a commitment to ultimacy, even when clarity fades. And yet, many religious systems confuse the two, faith and certainty, and they mush them into one. And as a result, what they end up doing is they end up teaching that faith means no doubt. It means no tension. It means no ambiguity. And so when certainty cracks, they assume that faith has failed. But often what's actually failing is a mental framework that cannot handle complexity. And that's where deconstruction begins. Not as some form of rebellion, not as some form of egotistical arrogance, but as simple, down-to-earth honesty. There's a reason the same pattern shows up again and again in people who deconstruct. Psychologist and theologian James Fowler spent decades studying how faith actually develops over time. And one of his most important insights is this: faith matures in stages. Early stages heavily depend upon things like external authority, or shared certainty, or inherited beliefs. And that kind of faith is not bad. I want to be clear, it's not bad. It's a necessary part of the maturation process. But there comes a point, often in early adulthood, where life gets more complex than the framework that we inherited can handle. And when that happens, faith has two options. It can either calcify or it can grow. And when faith grows, Fowler identified the growth dynamic as a transition from one stage of faith into another, and specifically here, from a synthetic conventional stage of faith to an individuative reflective stage of faith. And this transition from the synthetic conventional to the individuative reflective, most people identify as deconstruction. Note that Fowler did not identify that move into deconstruction as a failure. He identified it as faith development. Now here's the hard part of that transition. Growth doesn't feel like growth while it is happening. Instead, it feels more like grief or disorientation, maybe anger or loneliness, even fear. Because you're not just questioning ideas, you're losing a God image. You're losing a sense of belonging. You're losing a moral map that once made it all clear to you. And you're sometimes even losing relationships. And that hurts. And that's real pain. And the grief that we experience in deconstruction often looks a whole lot more like confusion before it can begin to look anything like clarity. And so when people say that deconstruction feels kind of like death, they're not wrong, because something is indeed dying. But when it comes to spiritual growth and development, when it comes to transitioning from one stage to another, there can be no resurrection without going through a certain kind of death. Here's something that's really hard for a lot of churches to grasp. Many people deconstruct not because they want to be free to live lives of sin, because it's a lot more fun. Rather, they deconstruct because they are trying to stay morally and spiritually intact. You see, they have encountered all this new information, and it's playing absolute havoc with their old faith. They have this old framework that simply cannot handle the pressure of things like biblical scholarship, trauma awareness, their own lived experience, observable injustice, and even just identifiable contradictions. And for them to maintain that faith that they had inherited, that's going to require them to pretend for the sake of others and silence their conscience within themselves, and even maybe start calling cruelty faithfulness. Now, never, ever underestimate the power of social pressure to conform people into its image. But for those who deconstruct, something inside them starts to push back against that social pressure. Not because they want something less than faith, but because they want a truer faith. So for them, deconstruction is not about faith collapsing at all. It is about claiming integrity and refusing to live the lie. Let me be clear, deconstruction does not guarantee reconstruction. But when growth does happen, it often looks like this: less certainty, more humility, fewer slogans, deeper compassion, less obsession with being right, and a more of a commitment to being honest. And overall, what we see is their lived life of faith shift from like a performance to practice, from demanding answers to just being present, and from needing to control to willing to trust. Now, don't get me wrong. This is definitely not an easier path than what was walked before, but it is more true to life. And quite frankly, overall, it's just downright more loving. So if you're going through something like what I've described here, and if you're questioning more than you ever expected, and if you feel like you're going through this kind of transition, then here's the question that I want to leave you with. Is the process that you're experiencing making you more honest, more compassionate, more grounded in reality? If so, here's a secret. You don't have to call it deconstruction, even though that's what it is. You can just call it growth, because that's what it is too. And I would love to hear more about your growth, so feel free to take a moment and share some of your story in the comments. And if you've made it this far, I'd love it if you were to like and subscribe. I'm Bo McGuffey with the Evolving Christian Faith Network. Until next time, peace.